He didn't even look at her when he threw her off the stagecoach. Victor Hale just leaned out the window, grabbed Clara Whitmore's wrist with one hand and her worn leather satchel with the other, and made a decision about her life in less than 3 seconds. The door swung open at full speed. The ground was hard and dry and completely unforgiving. She hit it with her left shoulder, then her cheek, and the dust came up around her like a curtain closing on a stage. The satchel landed 10 feet away. Victor didn't call out, didn't look back. The stagecoach kept moving, its wheels grinding over the rutted road until the sound faded into nothing, and Clara Whitmore lay in the dirt in front of an entire town that did not move a single muscle to help her. That was the moment everything changed. Not just for Clara, all of them. If you've ever been left behind by someone you trusted completely, if you've ever watched a door close on the life you thought you were walking toward, then stay with me, because this story is going to go somewhere you don't expect. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. I promise you won't want to miss what happens next. While you're at it, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that dusty road in Blackwater Crossing, New Mexico, 1878, and find out what happens to a woman when the world decides she's worthless. The settlement of Blackwater Crossing was not a town so much as a collection of decisions that hadn't killed anyone yet. It sat at the edge of a dry valley between 2 sets of hills that offered shade only in the early morning and late evening, as if the land itself was reluctant to give anything away without a fight. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse on days when the circuit judge bothered to show up, and a scattering of homes and outbuildings held together by timber, determination, and a kind of stubborn pride that people in hard places develop when retreating is no longer an option. The people who lived there had seen hard things. They were not cruel by nature, but they had learned the way people in isolated places always learn, that getting involved in someone else's trouble was a fast way to acquire trouble of your own. So they watched. Clara Whitmore pushed herself up from the dirt slowly, the way a person does when they're not sure which parts of their body still work correctly. Her left palm was bleeding from where it had caught the ground. Her cheek felt hot and wrong. She got to her knees first, then one foot under her, then the other, and she stood in the middle of the road with dust on her dress and blood on her hand and an expression on her face that was not quite crying and not quite anger and not quite nothing. It was the look of a person recalculating everything they thought they knew about their own life. She was 26 years old. She had a teaching certificate from a college in Ohio. She had left her mother's house 8 months ago with a trunk full of books and the absolute conviction that Victor Hale was the man she was going to spend her life with. He had written her letters for 2 years, careful, warm letters that described the West with a kind of reverence that made her ache to see it. He wrote about the sky. He wrote about the space between things. He wrote about building something that would last. What he had not written about, not once, was the gambling. The drinking that came before the gambling, and the violence that came after. He had not written about the other women, or the debts, or the way his charm curdled into something cold and mean the moment he didn't get what he wanted. He had not written about any of that. Clara retrieved her satchel from the dirt. It was the one thing she wouldn't leave. Inside it she kept her teaching certificate, her mother's letters, and a small notebook she had been filling with her own writing. Since she was 16, nothing anyone would publish. Just observations and half-finished thoughts and drawings of plants she didn't know the names of. The satchel's leather was scuffed now, and the clasp was bent from the fall, but it held, pressed it against her side, and looked up at the people watching her from the boardwalk. Nobody said anything. An older woman in a gray dress looked at Clara for a moment, then found something very interesting to examine in the far distance. 2 men near the livery kept their arms crossed. A child peered around her mother's skirt until the mother put a hand on the girl's shoulder and turned her gently but firmly away. Clara understood. She was a stranger. She had arrived damaged and alone, and in a place like this, that combination meant something specific. It meant you were someone else's problem that had wandered into their line of sight. It meant your misfortune might be contagious. She started walking toward the general store because it was the nearest building with an open door, and because walking felt better than standing still in the middle of the road where anyone could look at her. She made it about 40 feet before her left knee buckled. She didn't fall all the way down. She caught herself on a hitching post, one hand wrapped around the rough wood, and she stood there for a moment with her head down and her breathing ragged and the kind of pain moving through her shoulder that told her the joint was either badly bruised or something worse. The satchel hung from her other hand. She was not going to put it down. You're going to pull that post clean out of the ground if you lean on it much harder. The voice came from her left. She turned her head and saw a man standing at the edge of the boardwalk, one shoulder resting against a support beam, watching her with an expression that was carefully neutral, not warm, not cold, just present and attentive in the way that people who spend a lot of time outdoors learn to look at things they're trying to understand. He was somewhere in his late 30s, tall with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than any intentional effort, broad through the shoulders, and his hands, she noticed, were the hands of someone who used them constantly. He wore a plain dark coat that had seen better decades, and boots that were clean but not new. There was a stillness about him that was not relaxed. It was the stillness of someone who had learned to keep very quiet when they needed to. "I'm fine," Clara said, which was so obviously untrue that she almost followed it with an apology for saying it. "You're bleeding," he said. He nodded at her palm. I noticed. He pushed off the beam and stepped down from the boardwalk into the road. He didn't rush. He moved with the kind of deliberate unhurriedness that was either confidence or something that had grown in the place where urgency used to be. "Elias Crowe," he said. He didn't offer his hand because her hands were occupied, and she noticed that he noticed that. "Clara Whitmore. Where are you headed, Miss Whitmore?" She looked at him for a moment. Behind him, she could see that some of the people on the boardwalk had stopped, pretending not to watch. This was clearly something that required actual attention. "I'm not sure anymore," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said in months. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out before she could construct something more composed, more dignified, more appropriate to say to a stranger in a town she'd never intended to stop in. Elias Crowe looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "All right, come on then." He didn't wait for her to agree. He simply started walking toward a building 2 doors. Down not the general store, but a smaller structure that she would learn later, was used as a kind of informal gathering space by the women of the settlement when they needed a place. Away from the saloon and its particular atmosphere, Clara stood at the hitching post for a moment longer, because the decision to follow a stranger in a town where you knew nobody was not a small one, and because she was trying to determine whether her knee was going to cooperate, she followed him. Inside the building was simple: a table, several chairs, a stove that wasn't lit, shelves with some dry goods that didn't belong to anyone in particular. Elias Crowe pulled a chair out from the table and placed it near the window where the light was better, and he went to the shelf and found a clean cloth and a tin of water that someone had left there, and he put them on the table. "For your hand," he said. Then he sat down across from her, not hovering, not watching her, the way men sometimes watch women who are injured, with that mixture of sympathy and something that wanted too much in return. He just sat, and he was quiet, and after a moment he asked, "That man on the stagecoach, was he someone you knew?" Clara looked at the cloth on the table. She picked it up and pressed it against her palm. "He was my fiancé," she said. "Former. As of about 20 minutes ago." Elias didn't react with the expected response, no sharp intake of breath, no careful expression of sympathy, no question that was really just curiosity dressed up as concern. He just nodded once, as if this was information he was filing away rather than something to comment on. "Did he take anything of yours?" he asked. "Trunk? Money?" trunk, she said. The money was already gone. He had a habit. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask her to. She was grateful for that in a way she didn't have the energy to express. "There a job that brought you out here?" he asked. "Teaching position. In a town called Millhaven, about 40 miles east." She paused. "I have my certificate. I have letters from the county." "Millhaven's got a teacher," Elias said. "Young man named Prentice. Been there 2 years." Clara closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and looked at the cloth in her hand, which was now stained pink. Victor knew, she said, mostly to herself. He knew there was no position. He must have known for weeks. The room was quiet, except for the distant sound of something moving in the street outside, horses, or a wagon, or just the ordinary sounds of a place continuing to exist, while someone's life was being fundamentally restructured inside it. "There's a room above the livery," Elias said. "Holt, who runs it, rents it sometimes. It's not comfortable, but it's clean and it locks from the inside." "I don't have money for a room," she said. "I'll speak to Holt." She looked at him then, directly, in the way she'd been avoiding, because looking at people directly, since she climbed on that stagecoach in Missouri, had felt like something she couldn't afford. "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the window for a moment, at the dusty light coming through it, and then he looked back at her with an expression that was difficult to read, but wasn't difficult to trust. "Because nobody did anything," he said, "and somebody should have." Elias Crowe left her in the building with the cloth and the tin of water and told her he'd be back within the hour. He was gone for 45 minutes, which she spent mostly sitting in the chair by the window and watching the street outside and trying to construct a version of the next week that was survivable. She had $12 in her dress pocket. Victor had found the emergency money she kept in her boot 3 days ago, which was why it had been emergency money. She had kept back a smaller amount that even she sometimes forgot about, sewn into the hem of her dress in Missouri by her mother's hands on the morning she left. $12. Enough for a week, maybe, if she was careful. She had her teaching certificate. She had her letters of character from the college and from 2 ministers in Ohio who had known her since she was a child. She had her notebook. She had the satchel and whatever was left of the conviction that had brought her this far west. When Elias returned, he had a key. He put it on the table. 2 weeks, he said. "After that, if you're still here, we figure something else out. You paid for 2 weeks. Holt's going to let you help with some of the record keeping in exchange for the 3rd and 4th week, if it comes to that. His wife keeps the accounts, but her eyes are going. He said he'd show you the books if you wanted." Clara looked at the key. It was a small brass thing, ordinary and unremarkable, and it was the most concrete piece of goodwill she had encountered in 8 months of following Victor Hale across 4 states. "Crowe," she said. Elias. She looked up at him. "I'm not a woman who needs saving." He considered this. "All right, I'm saying it because I want you to understand that whatever this is, it's a loan. I pay back what I owe. I always have." He nodded, something shifting in his expression that might have been the beginning of something like respect, though it was too early to say for certain. "I'll remember that," he said. She picked up the key. The room above the livery was exactly what he had said, not comfortable, but clean, and it locked from the inside. There was a narrow bed and a chest of drawers, with a cracked mirror propped on top of it, and a window that looked out over the back of the settlement toward the dry hills. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the hills and the light changing on them as the afternoon moved toward evening no. Her shoulder ached. Her cheek was going to bruise badly. She could feel it already. The deep, swelling kind that takes a week to go through its full spectrum of colors. She opened her satchel and took out her notebook and sat with it on her knees. She didn't write anything. She just held it. After a while, she heard the sounds of the livery below her horses moving, water being poured, the ordinary animal sounds of creatures being cared for by someone who knew what they were doing. It was not a comforting sound exactly, but it was a real one, and real things had been in short supply lately. She thought about her mother. She thought about the letters she would eventually have to write. She thought about Victor Hale's face when he made the decision about her life in 3 seconds, and the absence of anything in his expression that suggested he thought it was a difficult choice. She thought about Elias Crowe saying, "Because nobody did anything, and somebody should have." It was not a romantic thing to say. It was not even particularly kind in the way that kindness is usually performed. It was something more basic than that, an acknowledgement that something wrong had happened, and that the wrongness of it mattered enough to respond to. She had not heard anyone say anything like that in a very long time. She put the notebook back in the satchel and lay down on the narrow bed without taking off her boots, because she was not sure yet whether this was a place she was allowed to fully arrive in. The ceiling above her was plain wood, and there were small gaps between the boards where the evening light came through in thin lines that moved slowly as the sun went down. She watched the light move. She was still watching when she fell asleep. 3 days passed before she spoke to Elias Crowe again. In those 3 days, she learned several things about Blackwater Crossing. She learned that the town had roughly 230 permanent residents and a fluctuating population of another 40 or 50 who came and went depending on the season and the work. She learned that the water rights situation in the valley was complicated and contentious and had resulted in 2 lawsuits and 1 fistfight at the saloon courthouse, which suggested the circuit judge had an interesting professional life. She learned that Elias Crowe owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, a ranch called the Bar C, about 6 miles from the settlement's edge, and that he was respected in the way that people who don't ask for respect tend to be, which is to say cautiously and from a slight distance. He had come to Blackwater Crossing 12 years ago from somewhere else that nobody knew precisely, bought land that everyone said was worthless, and turned it into something that was decidedly not worthless through a combination of methods that people described differently depending on how much they liked him. She learned that the settlement didn't have a teacher. The last one had left in the spring after a dispute over pay that the county had apparently been too disorganized to resolve. There were 14 children in Blackwater, crossing between the ages of 6 and 15, and they were being educated in a highly informal way by whoever happened to have time and inclination on a given afternoon. She learned this last fact from Holt's wife, Margaret, who was a compact and forthright woman in her 50s, who had handed Clara the account books on her second morning in town, with the words, "Don't make it pretty, just make it accurate. I can't stand people who make ledgers look nicer than the numbers deserve." Clara had made them accurate, and she had not made them prettier than they deserved. On the evening of the 3rd day, she wrote a letter to the county superintendent of education. She had her teaching certificate. She had her character letters. Blackwater Crossing had children who needed a teacher and no teacher to provide them. This was not a complicated equation, and Clara had spent enough of the last 8 months for things to work themselves out to know that they generally didn't. She sealed the letter and put it in her pocket and walked to the general store to ask about the post. Elias Crowe was at the counter when she came in. He was talking to the store owner, a spare man named Gebhardt, about some supply matter that involved feed and timing and a level of logistical complexity that suggested running a cattle operation was more administrative than romantic. He looked up when she came in, acknowledged her with a nod, and finished what he was saying to Gebhardt before he turned to face her. "Miss Whitmore, Elias. How's the shoulder?" "Functional," she said, which was approximately true if you didn't try to do anything above waist height with the left arm. He looked at the letter in her hand. "Post goes out Tuesday," he said. "Gebhardt keeps them." She handed the letter to Gebhardt, who took it without ceremony and put it in a wooden box behind the counter. "You wrote to the county?" Elias asked. "About the teaching position." Yes, he considered this. "They're slow," he said. "County. Could be 2 months before they respond." "I know," she said. "I wrote a firm letter." Something in his expression shifted again, that same movement towards something she couldn't quite name. He turned back to Gebhardt for a moment and then said, "I'll be heading out. Good seeing you, Luther." He walked to the door and held it open. She went through it, and he fell into step beside her on the boardwalk, not because she had invited him, or because he had asked, but because the direction they were both heading was the same. "There's 14 children in this settlement without regular schooling," she said. "I know. I'm going to start teaching them on Monday, whether the county responds or not," she said. "I'll use the gathering room." Margaret Holt said, "It's available in the mornings." "That'll work," he said. "I don't need your permission." "I know," he said. "I wasn't giving any." They walked in silence for a moment. "Victor Hale," she said. "He's gone east, I assume?" "Last I heard," Elias said. "Nothing keeping him here." "Good," she said. "Then I want you to know if he comes back. That's not your problem. Whatever he did to me is my business to settle." Elias stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before she realized it and turned to look at him. His expression was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not displeasure exactly, but a kind of careful attention that suggested he was choosing his next words with more deliberation than usual. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed. "Some things," he said slowly, "are not just your problem, even if they started that way." She looked at him for a long moment. She didn't argue. Not because she agreed with him, she wasn't sure yet whether she did, but because the way he said it was so devoid of possession or superiority or the usual texture of a man deciding he had authority over a situation that he had simply walked into. She didn't have the ready response she usually kept for those moments. "We'll see," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "We will." And they walked the rest of the way to their respective destinations without speaking. The sense, which was, Clara thought, the most comfortable silence she had been in for a very long time. The letter from the county came in 6 weeks, not 2 months. Clara was in the middle of her 3rd week of unofficial teaching when Gebhardt handed it to her across the counter, with the expression of a man who had learned over many years not to form opinions about other people's mail. She took it outside before she opened it, because she had developed a habit during the Victor years of not letting herself be seen having reactions to things in public spaces. The letter was 4 paragraphs. The first 2 were bureaucratic throat, clearing about processes and protocols and the importance of proper certification review. The 3rd paragraph said that Blackwater Crossing had been approved for a formal teaching position funded at the county level, effective the 1st of the following month. The 4th paragraph said that her credentials had been reviewed and found satisfactory, and that she was to report to the county office within 30 days to complete the appointment paperwork, which was 40 miles away, in a town she had no way to reach, without either a horse she didn't have or money for a stage she couldn't afford. She read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the satchel. Then she went back inside and bought a small bag of dried beans from Gebhardt, with 50 cents she had earned helping Margaret with the accounts. And she walked back to the gathering room, where 8 children were sitting in a patient and slightly chaotic arrangement, waiting for the afternoon portion of their lessons to resume. "Sorry," she said. "I'm back. Where were we?" "Long Division," said a boy named Amos with the tone of someone reporting a natural disaster. "Right," she said. "Long Division." She put the satchel down and went to the slate board she had propped against the far wall, and she did not think about the letter for the rest of the afternoon. Thought about it extensively after the children left, sitting alone in the gathering room with the late light coming through the windows and the sounds of the settlement settling into its evening patterns outside. Problem was not the appointment. The appointment was what she had asked for. The problem was the 30-day requirement and the 40 miles between her and the completion of it. She had earned just under $3 in the weeks since she arrived, which was not enough for the stage, and not enough for a horse, and there was nobody she could ask to lend her money because she had been in Blackwater Crossing for less than 2 months, and her entire social network consisted of Margaret Holt, who was generous but not wealthy, and Elias Crowe, who had already paid for 2 weeks of lodging that she was still working to repay. She was trying to determine whether there was a third option she hadn't thought of yet when she heard boots on the boardwalk outside and then a knock on the open door frame. Elias. He had a habit of appearing when she was in the middle of a logistical problem, which she had decided was coincidence, and not something she wanted to examine too closely. Margaret said, "You got something from the county today," he said. "Margaret has an efficient information network." "She does." He leaned against the doorframe. "Good news or the other kind?" "Both," Clara said. She told him what the letter said. She watched his face as she talked, not because she expected him to solve it, but because she had learned in the past weeks that his face was worth watching when he was thinking. He didn't perform consideration. He just did it. "I have business in Carver's Point in 10 days, he said. 12 miles past the county seat. I take 2 ranch hands. You're welcome to ride along." She looked at him. "That's not a coincidence, is it?" "The timing. It's not a fabrication either," he said. "I go to Carver's Point twice a year for supply contracts. It's on the calendar. I can't pay you for the trip. I didn't ask you to." She looked at the slate board, still chalky, with the remnants of long division. Then she looked back at him. "Elias, why do you keep doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone avoiding the question, but the silence of someone who found the question genuinely requiring of a real answer rather than an automatic one. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Fever. There were 3 weeks in the spring before she died where I couldn't leave the ranch, and there were things she needed that required someone in town to think to bring them. Nobody did." He paused. "I think about that sometimes. The things that don't happen because nobody thought to do them." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. "Her name was Ruth," he said. It was not an elaboration. It was just the name, offered plainly, because saying the name of a person you loved and lost was sometimes the only thing you could do with the weight of them. "I'll be ready in 10 days, Clara said. He nodded once and pushed off the door frame and walked back out into the evening, his footsteps steady and unhurried on the boardwalk until she couldn't hear them anymore. She sat with what he had told her for a long time, before she got up and went back to the room above the livery. In the 10 days before the trip to the county seat, Clara learned 3 things about Elias Crowe that she had not known before. The first was that he was not a natural man of few words, so much as a man who had spent years in conditions that didn't reward unnecessary speech, and that when he talked about something that mattered to him, the land, the cattle, particular problem of maintaining water access in a valley where the creek ran differently each season, he could talk at considerable length, with a precision and a care that was almost the opposite of the terseness people in town attributed to him. She learned this because he came to the gathering room twice in that 10 days, on the thin pretense of checking on something nearby, and both times ended up staying longer than the pretense required, and both times the conversation moved in directions she hadn't anticipated. The second thing she learned was that he had a daughter. Her name was Nora. She was 9 years old and lived at the Bar C Ranch with a woman named Della, who had been Ruth's closest friend and had stayed after the funeral to help and never quite found the occasion to leave. Elias mentioned Nora the way people mention something significant that they have gotten into the habit of keeping quiet about carefully, with a look on his face that suggested he was monitoring his own words. "She doesn't come to town much," he said. "She's shy. Has been since Ruth died. Has she had schooling? Della teaches her what she knows, which is considerable. But it's not," he stopped. "It's not consistent," Clara said. "No." She thought about this. "There are 14 children enrolled with the county now, once the position is official. I imagine Nora would be 15 if you wanted." Elias looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared when she said something that arrived ahead of where he expected the conversation to go. "She'd need to come to town," he said. "I know. Only if she's ready." Clara paused. "You might tell her about the other children. Not as a pressure. Just so she knows there's a place." Elias nodded. It was a small nod, but there was something in it, some private movement towards something he had been holding still for a long time. The third thing she learned was about the water rights dispute. She learned this not from Elias, but from overhearing an argument between 2 ranchers at the General's in Pewson's, a heated, technical argument about creek diversion and upstream usage, and a man named Aldrich Barr, who owned land in the upper valley, and had, according to both men, but for different reasons, been drawing more water than the original agreements allowed. She asked Margaret about it that evening. Margaret set down the account book she was reviewing and looked at Clara with the expression of someone deciding how much to say to a person who was genuinely asking rather than casually curious. "Bar's been here 15 years, Margaret said. He came in with money and a lawyer and bought the upper land before anyone thought to ask what he intended to do with the creek. He's been diverting more water every spring since his second year. Most of the small ranches in the valley are running short in the dry months. Elias has been keeping the Bar seagoing, but it costs him more every year. Has anyone brought legal action? Twice. Both times, Bear's lawyer found technical problems with the filings." Margaret looked at the account book. "He's got more money than anyone else in this valley, and he's patient. Patient men with money generally find ways to wait out the people who can't afford to be." Clara thought about this later, lying on the narrow bed above the livery. Thought about the way power worked in places like this, not through dramatic violence usually, but through accumulated small advantages and the willingness to be quietly relentless. She knew something about that. Victor had operated the same way for 18 months before she understood what was happening. The trip to the county seat took 2 days each way. Elias brought his ranch hands, a pair of men named Tully and Freed, who were in their 40s, and treated Clara with a respectful indifference that she found refreshing after weeks of the settlement's particular brand of speculative attention. They rode horseback, with a pack animal for supplies, and the country they traveled through was the kind of landscape that didn't apologize for itself, wide and dry and brutally lit, with a beauty in it that required patience to find, but that was genuinely there once your eyes adjusted. Clara rode better than Elias had apparently expected, which she knew because he said nothing about it, and she had learned that his silences had different qualities. Grown up in Ohio, but her uncle had kept horses, and she'd spent summers on his farm as a child. Particular Ohio farmland of her childhood had not looked anything like this, but though a horse moved under you was a constant, and she settled into the rhythm of it without difficulty. On the first evening, they camped at a creek crossing. Tully and Freed made a fire and heated beans and produced, from somewhere in the pack, a pan of cornbread that was better than anything that Simple had any right to be. Clara ate 2 pieces and did not feel apologetic about it. Elias sat across the fire from her and said, "You grew up with horses, my uncle's farm. Summers until I was 15. What happened at 15? My uncle sold the farm and moved to Cincinnati." She looked at the fire. I was heartbroken for about 2 years. Then I found other things, like teaching. Like the idea that teaching was something I could do that would put me in places where things were happening. Small places, where the work was real. She paused. My mother thought I was romanticizing it. Were you? She considered some, but not entirely. She looked up at him. There are 14 children in Blackwater Crossing who didn't have consistent schooling. That's not romantic. That's just a fact that needed addressing. Elias was quiet for a moment. Freed was telling Tully something at the other side of the fire, their voices low and comfortable. An animal moved in the brush, somewhere to the east. "What made you say yes to Hale?" Elias asked. He asked it without preamble, but also without aggression. The question of someone who wanted to understand something, not assign blame. Clara looked at him across the fire. "He was very good at knowing what to say," she said. "And I was 24, and my mother was worried, and I was tired of people being worried about me." He had letters. Actual letters, handwritten, that said exactly the right things. She stopped. "I'm an educated woman, Elias. I knew better than to make a decision based on letters. I thought I was being careful. I thought I was looking at the whole picture." "You were looking at the picture he was showing you." "Yes," she said it flatly. Not with self-pity, which she had largely exhausted, but with the particular weight of someone who had looked at a truth from many angles and found it consistently true. He was very good at that, showing you just the part that worked. "How long before you knew?" Really new? 3 months after I left Ohio. She paused, but I knew something was wrong before that. I just hadn't let myself call it what it was. Elias looked at the fire. Ruth was sick for 8 months before she died, he said. I knew what was coming by the 4th month, maybe earlier. But there's a kind of knowing that you hold in one part of yourself and don't let spread to the rest. Because if it spreads, you have to act on it, and you're not ready to act on it yet. He was quiet for a moment. I think that's a human thing. Not a weakness exactly, just the way people work. Clara looked at him for a long time. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it is. The fire made its sounds. The horses shifted in the dark nearby. Above them, the sky was extravagant in the way that only happened this far from lamplight and population. And Clara sat with the particular strange feeling of being comforted by something she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. She did not examine the feeling too closely. She was still new to allowing things to be uncomplicated. The county seat was called Prescott Junction, which was larger than Blackwater Crossing in the way that a filled bucket was larger than a half-filled, one same basic form, just more of it. Courthouse building was more solid than she expected, with actual glass windows, and the county superintendent of education turned out to be a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Hanover, who wore her gray hair in a style that suggested she had stopped caring about other people's opinions of it at some point in the early 1860s and had never looked back. Clara had been preparing to argue. She had marshaled her credentials and her character letters and her enrollment numbers and the particular firm but reasonable tone she had developed for conversations with institutional authority. She set all of it on the desk. Mrs. Hanover looked at the credentials and said, "Certified from Hargrove College in Ohio?" "Yes, ma'am. I went to school with a woman who taught at Hargrove for 30 years, Gretchen Olich. Did you know her?" "Not personally, but I know her work. I used her mathematics curriculum in my first 2 years of study." Mrs. Hanover's expression changed slightly, the particular shift that happens when a person decides, on the basis of one piece of information, that you are probably worth taking seriously. The appointment was finalized in 40 minutes. Clara walked out of the courthouse with official papers and a formal salary figure that was not generous but was real, and she stood on the steps in the morning sun, feeling something she identified, after a moment, as legitimate. Not happy, exactly. Not triumphant, just legitimate. Like she had a place in this story that had been properly established, rather than informally arranged. Elias was waiting with the horses at the end of the street. He looked at her face when she walked up, and whatever he saw there was sufficient. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. "I'm officially the teacher of Blackwater Crossing." He handed her the reins of her horse. "No, congratulations," he said, and it was so plain and so fun performed that it landed exactly as well as something louder and more theatrical would not have. The return ride was easier in the way that return rides, usually where the goal was behind them rather than ahead, and the urgency that had sat in Clara's chest for weeks had loosened into something quieter. Talked more on the return trip, and she noticed that Elias asked questions that were not the ordinary kind, not the questions people asked to fill silence, but the ones that came from actual wanting to know. He asked about Ohio, about the kinds of books she used in teaching, and why she made those particular choices. He asked about her mother, and she found herself talking about her mother for longer than she intended to, describing her with the particular combination of affection and frustration that was the hallmark of any true account of a person you loved and found genuinely difficult. He laughed once at something she said about her mother's opinion of Western American geography as a suitable location for any enterprise that a sensible woman would undertake. Brief laugh, and it surprised her not because it was unexpected from him. Exactly, but because it changed his face in a way that suggested the version of himself he walked around in daily was a somewhat reduced version, and that the fuller version was in there somewhere, appearing occasionally at creek crossings and campfires. On the second evening, she asked him about Nora. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, and she was preparing to say, "Never mind," when he said, "She used to talk constantly. Before Ruth, She had questions about everything. Every bird, every rock, every word she didn't know yet. He paused. She still has them. The questions. She just stopped asking them out loud. To you? To anyone. He looked at the horizon. Della says she talks more in the mornings before breakfast. I've tried to be up early enough to catch it, but by the time I come in from the first round, she's usually gone quiet again. Clara thought about the shape of the child with her questions, retreating into some internal space where they were safe because they weren't being seen. What does she ask about? In the mornings when she does talk. Elias looked at her. Books, mostly. What things mean. Where places are. A pause. She asked Della last week what the Mississippi River looks like in winter. Della didn't know. It freezes in the upper parts, Clara said. Further south it runs slow and brown. My grandfather saw it in January once and said it looked like the land was trying to forget it was a river. Elias was quiet for a moment. I'll tell her that, he said. He said it with such particular care that Clara had to look away for a moment at the landscape going orange and long-shadowed around them, and she thought about the things that happened between people that were too small to name, but too significant to ignore. They arrived back in Blackwater Crossing on a Thursday afternoon. Tully and Freed peeled off toward the ranch, and Elias rode with Clara as far as the livery, where he waited while she dismounted and handed her horse off to Holt's boy. Thank you, she said, for the trip. Thank you for the company, he said. It was direct without being heavy, and she accepted it as such. She was almost to the door of the livery when he said her name, turned. The county papers, he said. You should bring them to the next town meeting, first Tuesday of the month. Bear will be there. He tends to think the settlement operates around his interests. He paused. It's useful for him to see that other things are happening. She looked at him for a moment, trying to understand the subtext of this. Is there a reason Barr would care about a teaching appointment? Barr cares about anything that changes the weight of things here, Elias said. More children educated, more families with stakes in the settlement's future, more people with reasons to stay and fight for what's theirs. He met her eyes. He prefers the valley to stay the way it is. Small, manageable, dependent on him for the water. Clara stood in the late afternoon light and felt the outlines of something larger than her own situation taking shape around her. I'll be at the town meeting, she said. I thought you would be, he said. Turned his horse and rode back toward the Barsea, and Clara watched him go until the road bent and he was out of sight. Then she picked up her satchel and went inside, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and took out the county papers and looked at them in the failing light. Official. Real. Hers. She thought about Aldrich Barr, a man she hadn't met yet, and the way water moved or didn't move through a valley depending on where someone had put a wall. She thought about the 14 children in her unofficial classroom who were about to become 15 if a 9-year-old girl at the Barsea Ranch could be persuaded that there was a place for her questions. She thought about a man who rode 40 miles to conduct his regular business, who happened to have room for one more rider, who happened to ask the right questions at campfires, who had a daughter who had stopped talking out loud, and who described the Mississippi River as land trying to forget it was a river. She opened her notebook and wrote a few lines, not a story, just the beginning of a thought she didn't have the full shape of yet. She wrote about what it felt like to arrive somewhere with nothing and discover that the nothing was a different kind of something than you'd understood it to be. She wrote about the $12 sewn into a hem and a key on a table and a brief laugh at a campfire, and how the smallest specific things were sometimes the only truthful way to describe what was actually happening in a life. She didn't read it back. She closed the notebook and put it in the satchel. Through the floorboards, she could hear the livery settling into its nighttime sounds, the horses breathing, the wooden walls adjusting to the temperature, Holt moving around below with his lamp, the sounds of a place that was becoming, in spite of everything, recognizable. She did not call it home yet. She was not someone who did things like that carelessly, but she let herself sit with the possibility of it, just for a moment, in the quiet room above the livery, with the county papers on the bed beside her and the notebook oak back in its place, and the hills outside, the window going dark against a sky that had not yet decided whether it would be clear or clouded before morning. She would find out when the morning came. That, she was learning, was generally how it worked out here. You found out when the morning came, and then you made something of what it brought you, and then you got up the next day and did it again. It was not a comfortable way to live, but it was, she was beginning to think, a real one. The town meeting was held on the first Tuesday of October in the back room of the saloon, which was the largest interior space in Blackwater Crossing that wasn't a barn. Someone had made an effort. The tables had been pushed to the walls, and chairs, arranged in rough rows, facing a raised platform that was really just two freight crates pushed together and covered with a plank. A lamp hung from the center beam and cast the kind of light that made everyone look slightly more serious than they probably were. Clara arrived early, which she had learned was the only way to arrive anywhere if you wanted to see how a room arranged itself, before the people in it started performing for each other. She took a chair near the side wall, not in the front and not in the back, where she could see the door and the platform with equal ease. She had the county papers in her satchel. She had been to 2 previous town meetings since her arrival, both times as an observer, both times quiet enough that several people seemed to forget she was there, which she had found more useful than any amount of introduction. Tonight was different. Tonight she had something to say. The room filled slowly, in the way that rooms in small settlements filled people, arriving in the particular order that reflected their relationship to the proceedings, with those who had business sitting early, and those who came out of social habit or boredom drifting in closer to the start. Elias came in with Tully about 10 minutes before the meeting was called to order, and took a position near the back wall rather than a chair, which Clara understood was habit rather than statement. He was a man who liked to be able to see the whole room. Aldrich Barr arrived last. She recognized him before anyone said his name, because he moved through the room the way certain men moved through spaces they considered their own, not with aggression, but with a kind of settled expectation that the room would accommodate itself to his presence. He was somewhere in his early 50s, heavy-set in the way of a man who had been powerfully built and had since added to the original structure, with a broad face and small, alert eyes that moved over the room with the particular attention of someone who was always calculating the weight of things. He wore a good coat. His boots were better than Elias's. He acknowledged people as he moved toward the front row, not warmly, but with the minimal social investment of someone who understood that gestures of friendliness were a currency and saw no reason to spend it carelessly. His lawyer was with him, a younger man named Sefton, whom Clara had heard mentioned in the context of both the previous legal filings and the previous legal defeats. Sefton had the look of a man who had been trained to find technical problems with other people's arguments, and had developed such facility with this particular skill that he now applied it to everything, including probably his own dinner. The meeting was called to order by a man named Aldous Webb, who served as the settlement's informal mayor, in the way that one person in every small place serves not because anyone elected him, but because nobody else wanted the job, and he was organized enough to keep track of when the meetings were supposed to happen. Webb was in his 60s, a former freighter who had settled in Blackwater Crossing 8 years ago, and he ran the meetings with the combination of basic competence and minimal enthusiasm that the position seemed to require. First item was the water rights situation. Clara had expected it would be. She listened as 2 ranchers from the south end of the valley, brothers named Garrett and Paul Dunmore, laid out the same complaint she had heard pieces of. For the past 6 weeks, the creek diversion, the increasing shortfall in the dry months, the impact on their cattle and their crops. They spoke carefully, with the carefulness of people who had been through this before, and knew how the other side responded, and they presented numbers that they had written on a folded piece of paper that Garrett kept smoothing out and then folding back up as he talked. Bear waited until they finished. Then he said, in a reasonable and almost genial tone, "The diversion on my property is consistent with the original land agreement. Mr. Sefton has the relevant documentation." Sefton produced the relevant documentation. It was a sheaf of papers that he presented not as if he were defending a position, but as if he were politely correcting an unfortunate misunderstanding. The original agreement, he explained, contained language about seasonal usage rights that the Dunmore brothers' calculations did not properly account for. He used the word unfortunately 3 times in 4 sentences. The room shifted, that particular shift that happens when a technical argument meets an emotional grievance, and the technical argument wins on points, even though everyone in the room knows something is wrong. Clara watched Elias from across the room. His expression hadn't changed. He was looking at Sefton with the same careful attention he brought to most things, and she could see that he was listening not just to the argument, but to the structure of it, the way it was built, where the weight-bearing pieces were. She thought about what he had said to her on the ride back from Prescott Junction. More people with reasons to stay and fight for what's theirs. Webb was moving to the next item on the meeting's agenda when Clara stood up. Several people looked at her. Barr looked at her. Sefton looked at her with the expression of a man who was already preparing to find a technical problem with whatever was about to be said. "I have an item," Clara said, regarding the school. Webb nodded in the way of a man who was mildly surprised but not opposed. "Go ahead, Miss Whitmore." She took the county papers from her satchel and held them up not to read from, but to establish that they existed, that they were real and official, and had been obtained through the proper channel. "Blackwater Crossing now has a formally funded teaching position at the county level," she said. "Effective the 1st of this month. We have 15 children enrolled, with 3 more families who have expressed interest for the spring term." She paused. "I mention this because it affects a number of things that the settlement will need to plan for. Proper schoolhouse, for one. The gathering room works for now, but it will not work in the winter, and it will not work as enrollment grows." He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Webb said, "That's fine news, Miss Whitmore. We'll add the schoolhouse to the infrastructure discussion for next month. There's a parcel on the east side of the main road," Elias said from the back of the room. "County land. I can make the inquiry about purchase." Barr turned his head and looked at Elias with an expression that was entirely pleasant and convenient. Clara thought, approximately the same warmth as a stone wall. "A schoolhouse is a significant investment," Barr said, "for a settlement this size." 15 children are a significant investment, Clara said. She said it before she had decided to say it, and she said it in a tone that was not aggressive, but was also not apologetic, and the room shifted again, a different kind of shift this time. Their education determines whether this valley has farmers and ranchers and business owners in 20 years, or whether it has a lot of families who moved somewhere else because there was nothing keeping them here. Barr looked at her. His small, alert eyes moved over her with the particular assessment of a man who was deciding whether he was dealing with a nuisance or something more complicated. "You've been here? What, 2 months?" he said. "Long enough to count the children," she said. Sefton made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a comment, and then thought better of it. The meeting moved on. But something in the room's atmosphere had changed, a small change, the kind that didn't announce itself and couldn't be pointed to directly, but that Clara recognized as significant because she had spent enough of her adult life learning to read the shifts in rooms that were controlled by men who didn't expect to be answered. After the meeting ended and people were standing and moving toward the door, she was gathering her satchel when Margaret Holt appeared at her elbow. "That was well done," Margaret said, in the tone she used for things that she meant precisely and didn't want to elaborate on. "I just stated facts," Clara said. "That's what made it well done," Margaret said, and went to find her husband. November arrived with the particular hostility that the New Mexico high desert reserved for the transition. Months, not the clean cold of deep winter, but an unpredictable, irritable cold that changed its mind 3 times a day and couldn't decide whether it wanted to be reasonable or not. Clara moved her classroom operation from the gathering room to the saloon's back room 2 mornings a week when the gathering room's stove proved insufficient and she wore an extra layer under her dress, and told the children that learning to concentrate when you were cold was a useful skill that life would require of them regularly. Nora Crowe arrived on a Monday morning in the second week of November. She came with Elias, who brought her to the door of the gathering room at 8 o'clock in the morning and stood outside while Clara came to meet them. Nora was small for 9, not unhealthily so, but in the way of a child who had been quiet for long enough that even her body had learned to take up less space. She had her father's stillness without yet having learned what to do with it, so it sat on her as something slightly too large, like a coat she hadn't grown into. She had dark eyes, and her hair in a braid that someone had done carefully and recently, and she was looking at a point somewhere between Clara's left shoulder and the middle distance. "Nora," Clara said, "I'm glad you came." Nora said nothing, but she didn't step back either. "The other children are already inside," Clara said. "Amos is the loudest. If you find him annoying within the first 10 minutes, I completely understand most people do. But he's also the best at fractions, if you ever need help with those." Something moved in Nora's face. Not quite a smile, but the preparation for once the slight relaxation around the eyes that happened when a child heard something unexpected from an adult. She looked up at her father. He nodded once. She went inside. Elias stood at the door for a moment after she disappeared. Clara watched him, watching the space where his daughter had been. "She asked me 3 times last night if you were nice," he said. "What did you tell her?" "I said you were fair," he said, "and that you knew about the Mississippi River." Clara considered this. That's accurate. She said that wasn't the same as nice. He looked at Clara with something in his expression that she couldn't entirely name, something between amusement and a deeper thing that was harder to look at directly. "She's right," Clara said. "Tell her I'm working on it." Corner of his mouth moved. He nodded once, pulled his hat down against the wind, and walked back to where he had left his horse. The first time Nora spoke in class, it was about geography. They were discussing the territories the maps Clara had drawn on the slate board, rough but sufficient, showing the country's general shape and the major geographic features. She asked the children to tell her something they knew about a place they'd never been. Amos said that New York had 1 million people in it, which he had heard somewhere, and that he couldn't understand how that many people didn't all fall into the river. A girl named Priscilla said her grandmother had come from Georgia, and that Georgia had the best peaches in the country, which her grandmother maintained as a fact that required no evidence. Nora, who had been sitting at the end of the back row for 2 weeks and producing competent written work and exactly 0 spoken words, said, "The Mississippi River freezes in the upper part, but it's slow and brown further south. My father says it looks like the land trying to forget it's a river." The room was not entirely silent, but it got quiet enough. Clara looked at Nora without making the mistake of making a visible thing out of the moment, because she had taught enough children to know that you could lose a fragile moment entirely by handling it too carefully. "That's a good description," Clara said. "Does anyone know what river system feeds into the Mississippi from the west?" The moment passed into the next moment, as moments did, but Clara held it in some part of herself for the rest of the day. That evening she sat with her notebook and wrote. She used his words. "He's been talking to her about what I said. They're having conversations neither of them would describe as conversations. This is how the quiet ones start coming back." She looked at what she'd written and then closed the notebook because some things were better observed than analyzed. The second week of November brought something else entirely. Closing up the gathering room on a Wednesday afternoon, latching the windows against the rising wind when she heard someone in the road outside using her name, not calling it, saying it, in a tone that she recognized before she had consciously identified the voice, because the body remembers things faster than the mind does, and her body had 8 months of experience with that particular tone. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went to the window and looked through the gap in the latch and saw Victor Hale standing in the middle of the road in front of the saloon, talking to a man she didn't know, and gesturing in the direction of the gathering room. He looked worse than she remembered. Thinner, with the kind of thinness that came from irregular meals and irregular everything else. His coat was good but dirty, and he moved with the slightly over-deliberate motion of a man who was managing some chemical equation in his blood. He had lost the smoothness that had been his most effective tool, the easy, particular grace that made people feel he was paying them special attention. In its place was something rawer and less controlled, and that, she thought, was more dangerous, not less. She stepped back from the window. Her heart was doing something unpleasant. She acknowledged this the way she had learned. To acknowledge unpleasant physical reactions to things, noted it, breathed through it, did not let it make decisions. She thought about what she had said to Elias in those early days. If he comes back, that's not your problem. She thought about what he had said in return. Some things are not just your problem. She was not going to run to Elias Crowe. She was also not going to stand in the gathering room and wait for Victor Hale to find her on his own timeline. She picked up her satchel, put on her coat, and walked out the front door. Victor was still in the road. He saw her before she was 3 steps from the door, and his face did something complicated relief and calculation, and something uglier underneath both of those. "Clara," he said, "Victor." She kept her voice level. She had practiced level. "You look good," he said, "better than I expected, honestly. What do you want?" He spread his hands in a gesture that was meant to suggest openness and managed only to suggest that he had practiced it. "Came to make things right," he said. "I made some bad decisions. I know that, some," she said. "I've been thinking about you, about everything I put you through." He took a step toward her. "I was in a bad place, Clara. The gambling. It was out of control, and I knew it, and I didn't stop, and I'm sorry." She looked at him. She was looking for the man she had believed in for 2 years, the one who had written careful, warm letters about the sky and the space between things and building something that would last. She looked and she could find only the absence of him, which was what had been there all along. She understood now not a person, but a performance of a person, a very good one. And performances were not things you could make something real with. "I don't believe you," she said. "I don't mean that as an attack. I mean it as a simple fact. I don't believe you're sorry. I believe you're in some kind of trouble, and I'm a familiar option." Face changed. The performance slipped. "You've got a lot of confidence for a woman who had nothing 3 months ago," he said. "I had $12 and a teaching certificate," she said. "Turns out that's enough." "Clara, you should leave Blackwater Crossing, Victor," she said. "There's nothing here for you." She walked past him. He grabbed her arm. It was not a violent grab. It was the kind that was meant to look, to anyone watching, like a man stopping a woman from walking away, which was its own particular kind of violence. His hand was tight on her forearm, and he turned her toward him. And his face had the expression she remembered from the bad months, the one that was all about needing her to understand something that she was being unreasonable about. "You're going to listen to me," he said. "Let go," she said. Flat, clear. Not a request. "We're not done talking. Let go of my arm." She heard boots on the boardwalk. Victor heard them too, because his grip shifted, not released, but recalculated. Elias Crowe came off the boardwalk and stood in the road 6 feet away. He wasn't moving fast. He wasn't moving with any particular aggression. He was just standing there with his full attention on the situation, and there was something in the quality of that attention, the utter absence of theater in it, that was considerably more unsettling than anger would have been. Victor looked at him. "Who's this?" Victor said. "This is the man whose property I'm standing near," Clara said. "Let go of my arm." Victor released her. It was not a graceful release. It was the release of a man calculating the odds and arriving at a number he didn't like. "This a friend of yours?" Victor said to Clara, with the tone he used when he meant something other than what he was saying. "Yes," Clara said. Elias looked at Victor with an expression that gave nothing and required nothing. He said, "Are you staying in town tonight?" Victor looked at him. "That's my business, it is," Elias said agreeably. "I'm just wondering whether I need to speak to Webb tonight or in the morning, about making sure you have what you need to continue your travels." The framing of it was so entirely civil that it took Victor a moment to understand what was actually being said. And in that moment, something moved across his face, something that started as contempt and ended somewhere closer to uncertainty. Got no authority here, Victor said. No, Elias said. Time. And I'm patient. He looked at Victor without blinking. Are you patient, Mr. Hale? Clara said. Mr. Hale, Elias said. Are you patient? Victor Hale looked at Elias Crowe for a long moment. He looked at Clara. He looked at his own hands, which Clara noticed were not quite steady. I just wanted to talk, he said to Clara. That's all. I heard you, she said, and I answered you. He stood there for another moment, and then he walked away, not toward the livery, not toward the saloon, just away, in the direction of the north end of the settlement, where the road continued out of town into the open country. Clara watched him go. Elias stood beside her in the road and also watched him go, and when Victor was far enough away that the watching was no longer a statement, Elias turned to look at her. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. Then more honestly, mostly. He grabbed your arm. I know, I was there. She looked at the road where Victor had been standing. He's not right. Something in him is worse than it was. I noticed. He'll come back, she said. It was not pessimism. It was the particular knowledge of someone who understood how Victor Hale operated not as a strategist exactly, but as someone driven by the need to not be dismissed, and dismissal was exactly what had just happened. Probably, Elias said. He said it without trying to argue her out of it. She looked at him. You were in town late, picking up supplies. I saw you come out of the gathering room. He paused. I wasn't following you. They stood in the road for a moment, the wind doing its November work around them. How is Nora? Clara asked, because she needed to talk about something else, and Nora was the right something else. She talked at breakfast. This morning, he said. Something happened in his face for about 10 minutes, about a book she'd been reading. She'd been reading it for a week and not said a word about it. What book? Something about birds. Della had it. I didn't even know we had it. Clara almost smiled. That sounds. Right. They come back through the things they care about. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she had stopped trying to categorize and had started simply allowing to be what it was. Come to the ranch on Saturday, he said, for supper. Della cooks better than anything. You're feeding yourself in that room above the livery. She looked at him. Is this about Nora? Or is it about supper? Both, he said, without the hesitation of someone constructing an answer. Is that a problem? No, she said, it's not. The next 3 days were quiet in the particular way that things were quiet before they weren't. Victor Hale had not left Blackwater Crossing. She knew this because Holt's boy saw him sleeping in the livery on Wednesday night and told Holt, who told Margaret, who told Clara on Thursday morning, with the expression of a woman delivering information that she expected to be taken seriously. Clara took it seriously. She told herself he was broke and needed a few days to get organized. She told herself he would move on because there was nothing here for him, and he was capable, even in his current condition, of basic self-interested calculation. She told herself she was not afraid, and the second part of that was approximately true. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the high alert, hyper-aware state that had become so familiar during the Victor years that it felt almost like concentration. She taught school on Thursday and Friday as usual. On Friday afternoon, Nora stayed after the other children left, ostensibly to help Clara clean the slate boards. Actually, Clara understood to be in the room longer, which was a thing that children did when they found a space that felt safe and were not yet comfortable saying so directly. They worked in companionable silence for a while, Nora wiping the lower portion of the board and Clara reaching the top, and then Nora said, without looking away from the board, "Are you afraid of the man who came to town?" Clara stopped wiping. She looked at Nora, who was still looking at the board, still wiping, but with the particular held quality of a child waiting for an adult to decide how much truth to give them. Sometimes, Clara said, less than I used to be. Nora wiped a chalk smear in a careful circle. My father says being afraid of something and letting it stop you are two different things. Your father is right, Clara said. Nora looked up at her then, directly, with those dark eyes that had her father's quality of attention in them. "Did he hurt you?" Before I held her gaze. "Yes," she said. "He did." Nora absorbed this with the gravity that certain children brought to adult information, not dramatizing it, not minimizing it, just holding it with both hands. "Is that why you came here?" she asked. "Partly," Clara said. "Partly I came here because I had a job. Partly I came because I thought—" She stopped and started again. I was wrong about someone. And being wrong about someone in that particular way takes a while to figure out. And by the time I figured it out, I was already on a stagecoach to New Mexico. Nora considered this. "Did you know you were wrong before you figured it out?" Clara looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I think I did." Nora nodded once, very slowly, as if this confirmed something she had been working on. "My father knew my mother was getting worse before he told himself. He knew," she said. It was said with the matter-of-factness of a child who had had a long time to think about something. "I could tell because he got very quiet. He gets quiet when he knows something he doesn't want to know yet." Clara stood with the chalk cloth in her hand and looked at this 9-year-old child who had just described the precise mechanism of her father's grief with more accuracy and less self-pity than most adults managed with years of distance. "You're very perceptive," Clara said. Nora looked at the board. "Della says I notice too much." "I don't think that's possible," Clara said. "I think noticing is the beginning of everything worth doing." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her slate and her things and went to the door, and just before she left, she looked back at Clara with an expression that was still cautious but was something other than entirely closed. "I'll see you Saturday," she said. For supper after she left, Clara stood in the empty room for a long moment. Outside, the wind was doing its work. The lamp on the table was burning low. Somewhere in the settlement, Victor Hale was sleeping in a livery and recalibrating something. And Clara didn't know yet what shape that recalibration was going to take, or when it was going to arrive. But she knew it was coming. The way you knew when a storm was building at the edge of the horizon, not the details of it, just the certainty of it, and the knowledge that certainty was not the same as helplessness. She put out the lamp. She picked up her satchel. She walked back to the room above Holt's livery, through the cold evening air, her boots on the hard-packed road, her breath making small temporary clouds in front of her face that the wind took immediately and scattered. She was thinking about Nora. She was thinking about what it meant to notice things, and what it cost, and what it was worth. She was thinking about Saturday. She was not thinking about Victor Hale, which was a thing she was choosing actively. The way you chose to put one foot in front of the other on a road. You'd already decided to walk, and the choosing was the thing, and the walking came after. She got to the livery and unlocked the door and went up the stairs. She sat on the bed and took out the notebook. She wrote, "The children know more than we think and less than they pretend, and the ones who've been quiet the longest have the most stored up. I need to remember that. I need to remember that quiet is not the same as empty." She looked at the ceiling. She thought about a man who got quiet when he knew something he didn't want to know yet. She closed the notebook and lay down. The wind moved along the walls of the building, looking for gaps, which was what wind did, and the building held, which was what it was built to do, and eventually she slept. Saturday came with a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be beautiful or threatening, which was, Clara thought, an accurate reflection of the week that had preceded it. She rode out to the Bar C with Elias, who had come into town that morning on other business and offered the company without making a production of it. The ride took 40 minutes, and they spent most of it talking about the children Amos's fractions, a girl named Lucia who had arrived 3 weeks ago with her family from somewhere in Texas, and who read 2 years above her age. The question of what to do about the older boys who were at the edge of what Clara could teach them with the materials she currently had. "There's a man in Prescott Junction who imports books," Elias said. "Educational texts. Mostly. He supplied the last school district before they reorganized the county boundaries. I wrote to 3 publishers in Philadelphia last month," Clara said. "Gebhardt let me use the store's postal account. Did Gebhardt know you were doing that? He knew I was sending letters. He didn't ask what kind. She paused. Margaret said it was fine. Margaret Holt has been running things in Blackwater Crossing for 15 years, and everyone knows it, and nobody says it out loud. Elias said, which was the most he had said in one sentence about local politics in her experience. And she took it as a sign that the ride and the cold air and the week's accumulated pressure was loosening something in him. She's good at it, Clara said. She is. He looked at the road ahead. Ruth used to say that the people who actually ran things in frontier settlements were always the ones who didn't want credit for it. The ones who wanted credit usually made a mess of it. Clara considered this. Was she usually right about things like that? About most things, he said. It was not a performance of grief. It was just the plain fact of it. The kind of statement that a person made when they had been missing someone long enough that the missing had become simply part of the landscape. The Bar C appeared. As they came over the rise, a collection of structures that had been built with intention rather than haste, which distinguished it from most of what Clara had seen in the territory. The main house was timber and adobe, larger than she expected, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and a barn to the east that was in better condition than half the buildings in the settlement. There were corrals, a bunkhouse, a structure that appeared to be a smokehouse, and the particular organized quality of a place run by someone who understood that the difference between a ranch that survived and one that didn't was usually in the details. A woman came out onto the porch before they had reached the gate. Della was in her mid-40s, compact, dark-haired, with a face that had weathered without becoming hard and eyes that moved over Clara with an assessment that was frank enough to be slightly uncomfortable. She had a dish towel over one shoulder, and her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, which suggested she had been in the middle of something that mattered more than the temperature. "You must be the teacher," Della said. "Clara Whitmore," Clara said. "Della Marsh." She stepped off the porch and shook Clara's hand with a grip that was not performing anything. "Nora's been up since 6. She set the table twice." Clara looked at Elias. He had the expression of a man experiencing something he didn't know how to categorize, but was not sorry about. "Twice?" he said. "She didn't like where she put the forks the first time," Della said, with the particular tone of someone reporting an event that was both slightly absurd and entirely dear. She turned and went back inside, leaving the door open. Supper at the Bruised C was not the polished affair that the table setting suggested. Nora had laid it out with the careful intention of a child who had decided something mattered, which meant mismatched china and forks, of 3 different patterns, and a candle that had been found somewhere and placed in the center with such seriousness of purpose that nobody mentioned that it was listing noticeably to the left. They had venison stew and cornbread, and something Della did with dried apples that was technically not a pie, but was better than most pies Clara had eaten. The conversation at the table moved in the way of people who were still learning each other's rhythms, some silences that were comfortable and some that weren't quite, some threads that went somewhere and some that didn't. The particular negotiation of 4 people who wanted to be in the same room, but were all arriving from different places. Nora ate her supper with the concentrated attention of a child who had given up trying to participate in adult conversation and was focusing on what she could control. Clara watched her, and she could see the small movements, the way Nora's eyes tracked to whoever was talking, the minute adjustments of her expression that told you she was listening to everything. Clara asked her, partway through the meal, what the most interesting thing she'd read that week was. Nora looked up. She glanced at her father, who was looking at his plate, and at Della, who was cutting her cornbread. "There's a bird called the wandering albatross," Nora said. "It can fly for years without landing. It sleeps on the water." "That sounds like an impractical design," Clara said. "It lives for 60 years, Nora said with a slight defensive edge that was the closest thing to animation Clara had heard from her in a social setting. "Fair point," Clara said. 60 years is a good argument for any design." Nora looked at her for a moment, recalibrating. "They mate for life. she added, slightly less defensively. Most things that survive long enough figure out that loyalty is practical, Elias said, without looking up from his plate, and the table went quiet for a moment in the particular way that happened when someone said something that turned out to be heavier than it looked. After supper, Della put on coffee and the adults sat at the table while Nora went to the main room with her book, which was Clara confirmed by looking the bird book. Della and Clara talked about the water situation, which Della had opinions on, and about the Dunmore brothers, and about Aldrich Barre with the particular frankness of a woman who had been watching frontier politics for long enough to have formed settled views on most of the participants. He'll move against the school, Della said. Not directly. He never does anything directly. But he'll find a way to complicate it. The county appointment is official, Clara said. He can't touch the funding. He doesn't need to touch the funding, Della said. He needs to touch the building. If you stay in that gathering room through the winter, the county will have grounds to review the placement. Their language requires adequate facilities. I looked it up. She looked at Clara with the expression of someone who had been doing research and was mildly impatient to share it. He knows that language. His lawyer found it. Clara looked at Elias. The parcel on the East Road, she said. I wrote to the county land office last week, he said. Haven't heard back. How long? Could be a month. Could be 2. Della put her coffee down. There's another option. The old Mercer building on the south end of the main road. Mercer's been gone 3 years, and it's county property now, by default. I looked that up too. Clara looked at Della with something that was not quite surprise, but was close to it. You looked a lot of things up, she said. Someone had to, Della said without apology. She rode back to town in the early evening, with the cold coming down properly. Now her coat pulled close and her breath misting. Elias rode with her. They didn't talk much on the way back, but it was the good kind of not talking, the kind that happened when two people had spent enough time together that silence no longer required justification. He left her at the livery with a nod and a brief word about the Mercer building and rode back toward the bar C. And Clara stood at the door of the livery, for a moment watching his horse disappear into the darkening road, and feeling something that she could not precisely name, and was not yet ready to precisely name. But that was real in the way that the cold was real, and the county papers were real, and Nora's careful table setting was real, the particular reality of things that were true, even if they were also complicated. She went upstairs and lit the lamp and sat with her notebook. She did not write about Elias. She wrote about Della, about the way certain women in certain situations developed an expertise in institutional detail because it was the form of power available to them, and about how that expertise was consistently underestimated by the people it was designed to address. She wrote about Nora and the albatross and the idea that some creatures were built for long distances and that this was not a flaw. She wrote until her hand was cold, and then she stopped. Victor Hale had been in Blackwater Crossing for 9 days when he came to the schoolroom. Clara knew he was still in town. She knew it the way you knew the weather was going to turn, not from one specific sign, but from the accumulation of small signals, the atmosphere of the thing. Holt's boy had seen him twice more. Webb had asked him his intentions once and received an answer that was technically responsive and practically meaningless. He had been sleeping at the saloon, apparently paying for the room with money that appeared to have no obvious source, which meant either he had found someone to borrow from or he had found someone to take from. She had told herself she was prepared. She was partially right. It was a Wednesday, the last day of November, and she had 9 children in the gathering room, working on a geography assignment, drawing maps from memory, which was a thing she assigned regularly because it required both knowledge and imagination, and showed her things about the children that other assignments didn't. Nora was in the front row. She had been coming every day for 2 weeks. The door opened at 10 in the morning without a knock. Victor stepped inside. He looked at the room, the children at their desks, the maps half drawn on their slates, slate board at the front, Clara standing beside it with a piece of chalk in her hand. He looked at all of it with the slightly unfocused expression of a man who had not entirely planned this and was now constructing the plan in real time. "Close the door," Clara said. Her voice came out level, closed it behind him. "School hours," she said. "Whatever you need can wait. I need to talk to you," he said. 9 children were looking at him. Clara looked at Nora, whose face had gone very still in the way that it went still when something was wrong, and she was trying to be smaller than she was. "Children," Clara said, "please continue your maps." Quietly, she set the chalk on the edge of the board and walked toward Victor, which was the opposite of what her body wanted to do, and she stopped, 6 feet from him, and lowered her voice. "Not here," she said. "Not in front of my students. I'm not leaving until we talk," he said. Up close, he was worse than the last time she had seen him. The thinness had progressed. His eyes had the particular brightness of someone who wasn't sleeping, or wasn't sleeping cleanly. He smelled of stale wool and something sharper that she didn't want to identify. "Then we'll talk," she said, just as quietly. "But we'll talk outside. You'll run." "I won't run," she said. "I'm the teacher of record in this county. I have 9 children in this room, and I'm not going anywhere until they go home at noon." He looked at her. He looked at the children. Nora had her eyes on her slate, and her pencil moving and her shoulders set in the precise configuration of a child who was pretending very hard not to hear. Something shifted in his face. "Fine," he said outside. She walked to the door. She opened it. She turned back to the room and said, "Amos, if anyone needs anything, come get me from the porch. I'll be right outside." Amos, who was 10 and understood more than he was given credit for, looked at Victor and then at Clara and said, "Yes." Miss Whitmore, in a tone that was considerably more grown than his usual register. She went outside. Victor followed. Porch of the gathering room faced the main road, which meant they were visible to anyone in the settlement who happened to be looking in this direction. And Clara positioned herself with this in mind, not hiding, not retreating, just standing where she could be seen. "Say what you came to say," she said. "I'm in trouble," he said. She had expected this. Knowing you will hear something doesn't make hearing it much easier. "What kind?" she said. "Cards," he said. "There's a man in Santa Fe I owe money to. Significant money." He paused. "He's not the patient kind." "How much?" he told her. The number was large enough that she understood immediately why he was here and what he thought the resolution looked like. "Victor," she said, "I'm a county school teacher. I make $32 a month. You're friendly with Crowe," he said. "Everyone in this town knows it. He's got money." She looked at him for a long moment. "You came here to ask me to ask Elias Crowe to pay your gambling debt," she said. When she said it out loud in plain language, it sounded exactly as unhinged as it was. Victor heard it too. She could see that he heard it. But desperation has a way of making unhinged plans seem viable, right up until the moment someone says them out loud. "He likes you," Victor said. "He'd do it." "He wouldn't," she said, "and I wouldn't ask." "Clara, no." She said it with the same flatness she had used when he grabbed her arm. Not anger, just the word, set down like something with weight and edges. "I am not going to do this. I am not going to be the way you solve a problem of your own making. Not again." His face did the thing it did when he didn't get what he wanted, a particular movement that started as hurt and ended somewhere considerably less sympathetic. "You think you're something now," he said, "because you've got papers from the county and a rancher who brings you places. I think I'm the teacher of Blackwater Crossing," she said, "and I think you need to leave." He stepped toward her. She did not step back. "I need that money," he said, and the way he said it was different from the other things. He'd said lower, with less performance in it, and more of whatever was underneath the performance, which was frightening in a different way than the performance had been. "Victor," he grabbed her arm. The same arm as before, same grip. Behind her, she heard the gathering room door open, which meant Amos had been watching, which meant Amos was braver than most adults she knew. "Amos," she said without turning around, "go to the general store and find Mr. Webb. Tell him Miss Whitmore needs him on the porch." She heard Amos's feet on the porch boards and then on the road. Victor looked at her. His grip tightened. "You're embarrassing yourself," she said. "Let go." Not until you listen to me. I have been listening to you for 8 months, she said. I've listened enough. She heard hooves on the road. Before she heard anything else, a single horse, moving with the purposeful speed of an animal that had been put into a faster gear and knew where it was going. She didn't know how he knew. She would never be sure whether Amos had somehow reached him first, or whether it was something else, some particular attention that Elias to the settlement and its sounds, and the things that were not right in them. Later she would not ask, because the how seemed less important than the fact. Elias came off the horse before it had fully stopped, which was the kind of thing that told you something about a person that they wouldn't tell you themselves. He walked toward them with the same absence of theater he always had, but something in the quality of it was different, now compressed, like pressure behind a door. Victor turned toward him but did not let go. You need to step back, Elias said. This is between me and Clara, Victor said. Not while your hand is on her arm, Elias said. Stopped 4 feet away. Step back, Mr. Hale. You don't. Elias stepped forward, took Victor's wrist, and removed his hand from Clara's arm. He did it with a mechanical certainty, not violent, not rough, but entirely without deference, and the removal was so deliberate that it contained within it the clear communication that the next thing, there was a next thing, would be a different category of response. Victor pulled his wrist back. He was breathing harder than the situation required. You're making an enemy, Victor said to Elias. You came into my county and put your hands on a woman twice, Elias said. I'm not the one making enemies. He looked at Victor with that particular quality of attention, the full, undistractable kind. How much do you need? Clara looked at him sharply. Elias. How much? He said again, still looking at Victor. Victor told him the amount, with the confused, reflexive hope of someone who had been drowning long enough that any offered surface looked solid. Elias looked at him for a long moment. I'll give you half, he said. Enough to get you to Santa Fe and settle the most urgent part of what you owe. In exchange, you leave Blackwater Crossing today. Not tomorrow. Today. That's not Victor started. It's what I'm offering, Elias said. You have about 30 seconds to decide, because Webb and probably 6 other people are going to be here in a minute, and at that point, the conversation changes considerably. Victor looked at Clara. She looked back at him without expression, because she had nothing left to give him, not anger, not sympathy, not the particular complicated grief of having believed in something that turned out to be hollow. That was all behind her now, somewhere on the road between Ohio and here. Fine, Victor said. Webb arrived with 3 other men from the settlement, including Garrett Dunmore, who looked at the scene on the porch with the expression of someone who had been hoping for something worth telling. Elias explained the situation to Webb with the economy of someone who had identified the essential facts and saw no reason to elaborate beyond them. Webb listened and nodded and told Victor, with the mild but unambiguous authority of a man who had been managing settlements for 20 years, that he was expected to be gone before sundown. Victor signed a paper that Elias had written in 2 minutes on the back of a supply. Receipt a simple acknowledgement of the terms, witnessed by Webb and Garrett Dunmore. Elias gave him the money in cash from a fold in his coat pocket, and the transactions was complete in the same matter-of-fact way that Elias conducted most things that mattered to him. Clara stood on the porch through all of it and watched, and did not say very much, because the thing that was happening did not require her commentary. When Victor walked away toward the livery toward, she supposed, whatever horse or conveyance he had arranged. She watched him go with the same attention she had used when the stagecoach left her in the road 3 months ago. And this time, the feeling was different. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter. The recognition of an ending that she had earned rather than been given. Webb dispersed the small crowd with the minimum necessary words. Garrett Dunmore lingered for a moment, looking like he wanted to ask something, and then thought better of it and left. When they were alone on the porch, she looked at Elias. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, I mean the money. I know, he said again. She looked at the road, now empty. He won't use it the way he said. Probably not all of it. Elias said. Some of it will get him far enough away that it matters. She looked at him. That's a generous interpretation. It's a practical one, he said. I'm not paying for his character. I'm paying for his distance. Clara stood with this for a moment. Inside the gathering room, she could hear the sound of children, the particular sound of 9 children, trying to be quiet and not entirely succeeding. She thought about Nora in there, with her slate and her half-drawn map and her albatross book in her bag. The children need to finish their lesson, she said. I know, he said. She went to the door and stopped, turned back. Thank you, she said. He nodded. It was the kind of nod that acknowledged something real, without making more of it than the moment could hold. She went inside. Nora looked up when she came in. The girl's face was doing several things at once: relief and something more careful, a question she wasn't quite asking. Continue your maps, Clara said. You've got another hour. She went to the board and picked up the chalk. Her hand was not completely steady. Took a breath, let it out, and drew the next geographic feature on the board, with sufficient accuracy that nobody would have known, unless they were watching very closely. And Nora was watching very closely, and their eyes met for a moment over the tops of the other children's heads. Clara gave her a small nod. Nothing dramatic. Just the communication of one person to another that the thing was handled and they were still here. Nora bent her head back to her map. That evening, Margaret Holt brought Clara a plate of food she hadn't asked for and set it on the table in the gathering room without comment, and sat down across from her with a cup of coffee that she had also not asked for, and which was, Clara discovered, exactly what she needed. Bar's going to hear about today, Margaret said. I know. He'll decide it means the settlement is consolidating around Crowe. Margaret looked at her coffee. He's not wrong. I'm not consolidating around anyone, Clara said. I know that, Margaret said. Bar doesn't see women as independent variables. It's a significant analytical failure on his part. She paused. He'll go after the school building issue. I'd put money on it. Della thinks the Mercer building. Margaret nodded. I already spoke to Webb about it. He's willing to put it to a vote at next month's meeting. She looked at Clara. I need you to have 3 people at that meeting who will speak in favor of it. Not Elias. Everyone knows where he stands. People from the south end of the valley who have children in your school. Clara looked at her. You've been working on this for a while. Since your first town meeting, Margaret said, when you said long enough to count the children. I thought that one knows how this works. She said it without warmth or its absence. Just assessment, precise and accurate. Clara ate some of the food. It was venison from the same batch or a similar one as what she'd had at the Bar C on Saturday. The world was small enough here that food told you where things came from. The Dunmore brothers, she said. They have 4 children between them. Yes, Margaret said. And there are 2 families on the Creek Road, the Pettiford family and the Santana family, with children enrolled. Pettiford has been here 6 years. He was friends with Mercer. He might have opinions about the building. He does, Margaret said. I spoke to him this morning. She looked at Clara with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was moving in that direction. You and I are going to get along fine, Miss Whitmore. We already do, Clara said. Margaret picked up her coffee and looked at it for a moment. Elias, she said. It was not a question or a statement, just the name sitting there. He's a good man, Clara said carefully. He is, Margaret said. He's also been alone for 4 years and not any worse for it, which means if he's making room for something new, he means it. Men who mean things are rarer than they should be. She put her coffee down. I'm not telling you what to do with that information. I'm just noting that I noticed it. Clara looked at the table. He paid Victor Hale's debt today to get him to leave. I heard. He didn't ask me. He didn't wait to see what I'd do. She stopped. Handled it, Margaret said. Yes. And Clara thought about the difference between a man who handles things because he thinks you can't, and a man who handles things because he wants to help you get to the next part. She thought about what that difference felt like from the inside, when you'd been on the wrong side of it for long enough, that recognizing the right side required some adjustment. And I'm still thinking about it, she said. Fair, Margaret said. stood up. Sleep. Tomorrow the schoolroom needs a teacher, and the Mercer building needs someone to write up a proposal for Webb. She paused. I'll draft the legal language if you write the educational justification. Deal, Clara said. Margaret left. Clara sat at the table for a while longer, with the plate and the cooling coffee, and the quiet of the gathering room around her. Through the window, the settlement was going through its evening. Motion's lights coming on, voices diminishing, the particular sound of a small place finishing its day. She opened her notebook to a new page. She wrote, "He removed Victor's hand from my arm, like it was a simple correction. Like the fact of it was unacceptable, and the response was obvious. I have spent 8 months trying to understand what it would feel like, to have someone respond to the obvious, as if it were obvious. Now I know." She looked at it. Then she wrote, "Margaret is right about the Mercer building. Margaret is usually right. I should stop being surprised by that." She closed the notebook and put it in the satchel, put on her coat. She walked back to the room above the livery through air that was cold enough now to mean it, and she unlocked the door and climbed the stairs and sat on the edge of the narrow bed that had been her world since September. She thought about the bar C and its porch, and Nora's table set twice, and an albatross that flew for years without landing. She thought about a man who got quiet when he knew something he didn't want to know yet. She thought about what it meant to be ready for something. She lay down. She was not sure whether she was ready, but she was beginning to think that readiness might not be a state you arrived at, so much as a direction you kept moving in, and that the moving was the thing, and the direction was what mattered, and that she had been moving in the right direction for long enough. Now that maybe the question wasn't when she would be ready, but what she was going to do with the readiness she already had. The wind pressed against the building's walls. The building held. She slept. The proposal for the Mercer building went to the town meeting on the first Tuesday of December, and it did not go smoothly. Clara had expected resistance. She and Margaret had spent the better part of 2 weeks preparing for it. Margaret drafting the legal language around the county default property claim, Clara writing the educational justification in the particular register of someone who understood that institutional arguments needed to sound like institutional arguments and not like personal appeals. They had the 3 voices Margaret requested. Garrett Dunmore spoke first, with the careful dignity of a man who had prepared what he wanted to say, and was going to say it, regardless of who was in the room. Pettiford spoke second, and he talked about Mercer with the frankness of someone who had known the man and thought the building being used for children was a better outcome than its sitting empty. A woman named Rosa Santana spoke third, in English that was deliberate and precise, and carried in it the weight of someone who had chosen every word carefully because she understood that some rooms required that kind of care. Barr listened to all 3 with the patient expression of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and was waiting for the preliminary performances to conclude. Then he said that the Mercer building required significant structural assessment before any county use could be authorized, and that the cost of such assessment was not currently budgeted, and that it would be irresponsible to place children in a building whose safety had not been verified by a qualified inspector. He said it reasonably. He said it with what appeared to be genuine concern for the children's welfare. Seftons nodded beside him in the measured way of a man corroborating something that required corroboration. The room shifted the familiar shift. Then Clara stood up. She had the county land office correspondence in her hand, 3 letters she had obtained through a process that had required writing 7 letters, 2 follow-up inquiries, and 1 very specific conversation with Mrs. Hanover and Prescott Junction, about which regulatory office held jurisdiction over defaulted county properties in unincorporated settlements. She had been working on this for 3 weeks. She had not mentioned it to Elias or Margaret because she had not been sure it would yield anything, and she had a habit, formed in the Victor years, of not announcing things she wasn't sure of yet. The Mercer building was inspected by the county land office in September of this year, she said, part of the standard assessment that accompanies property default. The inspection found the structure sound. I have the relevant correspondence. She held up the letters. If Mr. Sefton would like to review them, I'm happy to share copies. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Sefton looked at the letters. He looked at Barr. Something passed between them that was too quick and too small to be readable, but was readable in its effects, the slight recalibration of a position that had just lost its primary supporting wall. I was not aware of that assessment, Barr said. His tone had not changed, which was a skill, and Clara acknowledged it as such even as she responded to it. County land office records are public, Clara said. I requested them directly. She paused. I'd also note that the educational justification I've submitted meets every county standard for facility use. The enrollment numbers are current, the teacher of record is certified, and the county funding is confirmed. She looked at Webb. The building is available, sound, and needed. I'd like the settlement to vote. Webb looked around the room. He had the expression of a man who had run enough of these meetings to know when the momentum had shifted past the point of retrieval. All in favor of petitioning the county land office for use of the Mercer building as the Blackwater Crossing schoolhouse, he said. The vote was not unanimous. Barr and two men who were associated with his water interests voted against. Everyone else voted in favor. Clara sat down. Margaret, 2 chairs over, did not look at her, but her hand found Clara's arm briefly and pressed it once, which was, from Margaret Holt, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Elias, at the back of the room, was not looking at her either. He was looking at Barr with the particular quiet attention of a man noting the position of something that was going to require continued watching. But when Clara glanced back at him, he gave her a small nod, and she understood that the nod was not about the vote. It was about the letters. The 7 letters, and the follow-up inquiries, and the conversation with Mrs. Hanover, and the 3 weeks of work she had done without telling anyone she was doing it. He understood exactly what that had cost and what it had taken. She turned back to the front of the room. The Mercer building became the schoolhouse in the 2nd week of December. It required cleaning deep, serious cleaning of the kind that only a building that has been empty for 3 years requires. And this was accomplished over 2 Saturdays, with a group of 12 people that assembled through no formal organization, but through the particular social mechanism of frontier settlements, where a thing visibly needed to be done and people showed up, because showing up was what you did. Della brought Nora. Nora worked alongside Clara for most of the first Saturday, with a bucket and a scrub, and the scrub had decided this mattered, which meant she was significantly more effective than most of the adults in the room. They worked side by side without talking much, which had become their particular mode comfortable in the shared work, communicating in the peripheral way of people who had learned to read each other without requiring constant verbal confirmation. At one point, scrubbing the lower half of what would become the main classroom wall, Nora said, "It's bigger than the gathering room." "Yes," Clara said. "More children will come," Nora said, "when there's a real building. That's the idea." Nora was quiet for a moment, scrubbing. "I wasn't going to come," she said. "Cool. My father didn't push me. He just said there was a place." "I know," Clara said. "He told me." "I came because of the Mississippi River," Nora said. Clara stopped scrubbing. Nora kept going, her brush moving in the same careful circles. "He told me what you said about it. What your grandfather said. The land trying to forget it's a river." She paused. "I thought someone who knows about that kind of thing. Someone who thinks about things that way. I wanted to know more of those things." Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the wall and felt something move through her that was not easy to describe, a kind of fullness that was not happiness exactly, but that contained happiness, along with something more serious and more lasting. "I'm glad you came," Clara said. "I know," Nora said, and kept scrubbing. Elias painted the sign for the schoolhouse on a Sunday in mid-December. He did it on the porch in the cold, with a brush that was not quite the right width, and a pot of black paint that had been sitting in the Bar C's supply shed for longer than it probably should have. The letters were even but not elegant, which was a fair description of most things Elias produced, and Clara watched him do it from the doorway, with a cup of coffee, warming her hands. The sign said Blackwater Crossing School. Est. 1878. That was all. He had not asked her whether she wanted anything else on it, and she did not suggest additions because it was correct as it was. He held it up when he was done, to see how it looked at arm's length. Well, he said. It's good, she said. The R in crossing is a little wide. Nobody will notice. He looked at it for another moment, then set it down carefully to dry. He came and stood beside her in the doorway, and they stood there in the cold for a while, looking at the building's interior, the clean walls, and the desks that had come from 3 different sources and did not match, and the slate board that Tully and Freed had installed on a Tuesday afternoon with a level of focus that suggested Elias had been specific about his expectations. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the interior of the schoolhouse and not at her, which she had come to recognize as his preferred configuration for saying something that mattered to him. "I've been thinking about how to say something for about 6 weeks, he said. She waited. "I'm not good at the saying part," he said. "I'm aware of that. Ruth used to say I communicated like a man sending a telegram, everything essentials, nothing extra." "That's not the worst description," Clara said. "She meant it affectionately," he said. "Mostly." He was quiet for a moment. "The thing I want to say is that I'm not interested in rescuing you. I want to be clear about that. You don't need rescuing. Came here with $12 and a teaching certificate, and you built a schoolhouse in 4 months. And I think if I hadn't been here, you would have done it in 5 months, and it would have turned out about the same." Clara looked at him. "Elias, I'm getting there," he said. I'm saying it badly, but I'm getting there." He turned to look at her then, finally directly. "I'm interested in what comes after the building of the schoolhouse. What you do next, and the thing after that. I want to be in the same place as those things." He paused. "I want to be in the same place as you, is what I'm trying to say, if you want that too." Cold was doing its December work around them. Inside the schoolhouse, the smell of new paint and cleaned wood, and the particular promise of a room that was about to be used for something real. Clara thought about 8 months ago Ohio, and a man with careful letters, and a stagecoach, and $12 sewn into a hem, and a road that she had not chosen but that had brought her here. She thought about what it meant to have arrived at something by a route you wouldn't have selected, and to find, when you looked at where you were standing, that it was exactly the right place. She thought about the things she knew about Elias Crowe. Not the things she had been told or the things she had inferred, but the things she knew from actual experience, that he listened to conversations about birds and rivers and retained them, that he got quiet when he knew something he didn't want to know yet, that he paid attention to what was actually needed rather than what looked helpful, that he had a daughter who had started talking at breakfast again, about books and birds and whatever she was thinking about, and that this had happened because he had paid attention to what she needed and provided it without requiring her to ask for it in the right way, that he had said on the first day, because nobody did anything, and somebody should have, and had meant it not as a performance, but as a simple statement of how he believed the world should work. She thought about the room above the livery. She had not been thinking of it as temporary for some time now. She had been thinking of it as a way station, which was a different thing, not temporary and not permanent, but a place you stayed in while you figured out where you were actually going. She thought she might know where she was actually going. "I want that too," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded, and the nod contained everything the telegram style would not transmit: the relief and the depth of it, and the particular care of a man who had not been sure and was now sure, and was treating the sureness with appropriate seriousness. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stood in the doorway for a while longer, in the cold, looking at the schoolhouse, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else was required. Winter in Blackwater Crossing was not the worst thing Clara had ever experienced, which she would not have predicted in October. It was hard, the cold was genuine and unforgiving, and the isolation that a valley acquired in heavy weather was complete, in a way that required adjustment. but there was a particular quality to being inside something that held against the cold, knowing that the people around you were also inside things that held, that was different from being cold and alone, which was what winter had looked like in her imagination before she understood what it meant to be somewhere you belonged. Schoolhouse opened formally in January, with 17 children enrolled. Rosa Santana brought tamales on the first day, which established a precedent that Clara had no intention of correcting. Nora sat in the second row, which was progress from the back, and Amos sat in the front because Amos had decided, at some point in the fall, that being close to the information was worth the increased visibility, which Clara thought was evidence of genuine intellectual character. She wrote to her mother in February. It was the 7th letter she had sent since arriving in New Mexico, and the first one that contained the full account of everything that had happened, not softened, not rearranged, but accurate in the way that only letters to your mother could be when you were finally far enough from the hearts to see them plainly. She wrote about Victor and the stagecoach and the $12. She wrote about the room above the livery and the county papers and Margaret Holt and the town meetings and Aldrich Bar and the way institutional resistance worked when you understood its structure. She wrote about the Mercer building and the scrub brushes and Nora's particular intensity with a bucket. She wrote about Elias last, and she wrote about him carefully because her mother had opinions about men and about her daughter's judgment of men that were historically not unfounded, and she wanted to give an account that was honest rather than persuasive. She wrote, "He is not easy to describe because he does not perform anything. He is simply what he is, which takes some getting used to when you have spent time with someone who was always performing. He has a daughter who is learning to talk again after going quiet with grief, and he has been patient with that in the way of a man who understands that the things you wait for carefully are different from the things you wait for carelessly. Told me once that he was not interested in rescuing me. I believed him. I still do." She sealed the letter and posted it. Her mother wrote back in April with a letter that was 3 pages long and contained order, alarm, questions, more questions, a fairly detailed assessment of Western American geography as a life setting, and then in the final paragraph, in her mother's familiar slanted handwriting, something that Clara read twice and then folded into the notebook to keep. Her mother wrote, "I cannot pretend I am not frightened for you, because I am your mother, and being frightened for you is part of the position. But I will tell you what I see from here, which is that you sound like yourself in a way you did not for most of the past 2 years. I do not know what that man is like, but I know what you sound like when you are being treated well, and this is it. The water rights case changed in March. It was Della who found it, or rather, who created the conditions under which it could be found, which was Della's method with most things she cared about. She had been corresponding for months with a woman in Santa Fe who was a surveyor's widow, and who had, in her husband's papers, original territorial maps of the creek system in the Blackwater Valley from the period before any of the current ranches were established. Those maps showed something that neither Bear's legal filings nor the Dunmore brothers' complaints had addressed directly a secondary channel in the creek system that ran east of Bear's diversion point, and that, according to the original territorial records, constituted the primary designated watercourse for the Southern Valley properties. Barr's diversion was not just excessive. It was positioned in a way that the original land survey had specifically designated as the shared water corridor for the region. Elias sat with the maps for 2 evenings. He brought them to a lawyer in Prescott Junction, the county's general counsel, but a private attorney named Weston, whom Mrs. Hanover had recommended with the particular directness of a woman who understood that the right recommendation was more useful than a polite one. Weston looked at the maps and the original survey documentation and said with the careful language of a man who did not overpromise that the case was considerably stronger than what had gone to court before. The filing was different this time. It was not just the Dunmore brothers. It was 7 ranching families in the Southern Valley, with Elias as the lead plaintiff and it included the territorial survey records and Della's correspondence and a detailed accounting of water shortfall over 5 years that the Dunmore brothers had maintained in a ledger with the same dogged consistency they brought to everything. Barr's lawyer found fewer technical problems this time. The maps were primary documents. The territorial designation was unambiguous. What had previously been a dispute about usage amounts became a dispute about the fundamental premise of Burr's diversion, its location, its legality, and the 20-year pattern of cumulative harm it had produced. The circuit judge came to Blackwater Crossing in April, which was unusual. Judges generally required you to come to them, but the volume of documentation and the number of parties made the travel practical. He held the hearing in the saloon's back room over 2 days, which gave the room the distinction of having hosted both town meetings and territorial legal proceedings, a versatility that Gebhardt noted approvingly. Clara attended both days of the hearing. She was not a party to it. She had no land claim, no water rights, no formal standing. But she was a resident of the valley, and the hearing was open, and she sat in the back row on the left side with her notebook in her lap and took notes the way she always took, not for publication, not for any specific purpose, just because recording things carefully was how she had always processed the world. She watched Elias on the witness stand. He was exactly himself, spare, precise, without theater. He answered what was asked and did not elaborate past the question, and the effect of this in a legal context was significant because it read as complete credibility. He was not trying to convince anyone of anything beyond the facts he had direct knowledge of, and the facts he had direct knowledge of were, by themselves, more than sufficient. She watched Barr, who sat at his table with Sefton, and maintained his expression of reasonable patience for the full first day, and most of the second. On the afternoon of the second day, when Weston presented the territorial survey maps with a methodical clarity that left very little interpretive room, something in Barr's patient expression shifted a small shift, almost imperceptible, but Clara had been watching rooms long enough to catch it. It was the shift of a man recalculating a position he had held for 20 years. The judge ruled on the third day in a written decision that Webb read aloud at a special town meeting because the actual ruling was 40 pages, and most people wanted the summary. The diversion point was ordered relocated, at Barr's expense, to a position consistent with the original territorial survey. A water usage schedule was established for the creek system, overseen by a 3-person committee that included Garrett Dunmore, a rancher from the North End named Carlisle, and at the judge's specific recommendation, which surprised everyone and no one Margaret Holt. Barr did not speak at the town meeting. He sat in the front row and listened to Webb, read the summary, and then he stood up and left, and Sefton followed him, and the room watched them go with the particular collective exhale of people who had been holding something for a long time. After the meeting, Clara found herself on the boardwalk outside the saloon with Elias and the Dunmore brothers and several other people she had come to know well enough to stand beside on a significant evening. Garrett Dunmore shook Elias's hand with both of his, which was the Dunmore version of considerable emotion. Paul Dunmore said, 5 years, and didn't say anything else. 5 years said it. Elias accepted it all, with the same evenness he brought to everything. And when the group had dispersed into the evening, he stood beside Clara on the boardwalk in the cooling air. Della found those maps, he said. I know, Clara said. She's been working on it for 8 months. I know that too. He looked at the settlement around them, the lights in the windows, the ordinary sounds of a place at the end of a day that had mattered. Ruth would have liked her very much, he said. She always said Della was the smartest person in the valley. I told her I thought that was unfair to the valley. Was she right? She was right about everything worth being. Right about, he said. And this time the weight in it was different, not just grief, but a kind of retrospective love that had made its peace with itself without losing any of its depth. Clara looked at the main road of Blackwater, crossing the road where she had landed in the dirt 7 months ago, with a bleeding palm and a bent satchel clasp and $12 in her hem and nothing else that was reliably hers. thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere. Not the arrival itself, the moment you got there, but the longer process of actually arriving, the weeks and months of it, daily accumulation of small decisions and particular conversations and specific pieces of knowledge that together constituted the fact of belonging to a place. She thought about what it had cost. She thought about what she would not have chosen and what she would not trade. "Owe you for the room above the livery," she said. "I've been meaning to settle it." He looked at her. "You've settled it several times over. I told you I pay back what I owe." "Told me?" he said. "And I told you I'd remember." He looked at the road. "Holt told me last week he's renting it to Lucia's family now. They needed the space." Clara smiled at the road. "Good. There's a room at the bar C," he said. It was said carefully, and she heard the carefulness in it, the specificity, and the deliberateness of a man who was not speaking in euphemism. Nora asked about it. She asked if the schoolhouse teacher might need a better room than the one above the livery, now that Holt had given it away. Clara looked at him. "She's 9, Clara said. "She's perceptive," he said. "Gets that from her father." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm asking," he said, in case that wasn't clear. "I'm asking directly. I know," she said. "I'm thinking." "Take your time," he said. She looked at the road for a while. She thought about the notebook and its accumulated pages, the observations and half-finished thoughts, and the specific geography of a life being rebuilt from its own materials. She thought about what she had written after the first evening. On the porch of the bar C, she had not written it down yet, but she had been carrying it the idea that readiness was not a state you arrived at, but a direction you kept moving in, and that the moving was the thing. She had been moving in this direction for 7 months. She turned to look at him. "I'll need to keep teaching," she said. "That's not negotiable." "I know, and I'll need my own space. For working, for the writing." "There's a room at the east end of the house," he said. "Della uses it in the mornings. She says she'd share. You've talked to Della about this." "She brought it up," he said. "I didn't discourage it." Clara looked at him with the particular look she had developed for moments when Elias Crowe revealed, in his oblique way, that apparently spontaneous thing he was doing had been thought about for considerably longer than he was letting on. "How long have you been thinking about this?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Since the campfire at the creek crossing," he said, "on the way back from Prescott Junction. That was 5 months ago. October. The night he had talked about Ruth, and she had talked about her mother, and he had laughed briefly at something that surprised him, and the sky had been extravagant over both of them. That's a long time to not say anything, she said. You needed time to get where you were going, he said. I didn't want to be in the way of that. She looked at him. She thought about all the ways a person could love someone imperfectly, the ways you could fail and be failed. The ordinary human mess of it, the things you carried in from before that showed up unexpectedly and required patient navigation. She thought about the things she had not yet told him, and the things he had not yet told her, and the long, unfinished work of knowing someone. She thought that the unfinished work was the part she was not afraid of. Yes, she said. I'll come to the bar C. He nodded once. She thought he might say something else, but he didn't, and she found that she didn't need him to. The nod was sufficient because it was real, and real had been in short supply, for long enough in short supply that she had learned to recognize it and not ask it to be something more elaborate than it was. She moved her things to the bar C in the second week of May, which was not much, given what she had arrived with, but was more than $12 and a bent satchel clasp, which was the measure she used. Della helped her arrange the east room, which had a window that faced the hills and a desk that was better than anything she had worked at since Ohio. Nora supervised with the focused attention of a project manager who was 9 years old and entirely confident in her authority. She directed the placement of Clara's books on the shelf with the same seriousness she had used on the table setting in November, and Clara let her because some things were important to be part of, and Nora had understood that before being told. The end of it. When the room was arranged to Nora's satisfaction, Nora looked at the books on the shelf and said, "You have a lot about rivers." "I grew up near them," Clara said. Nora ran one finger along the spines. We don't have any rivers here. Just the creek. Creeks are rivers that haven't decided yet, Clara said psycho. Nora looked at her. That's not scientific. No, Clara said. True. Nora considered this with the seriousness she brought to contested propositions. Then she said, My mother had a book about wildflowers. Still have it. It's in my room. Clara waited. You can borrow it, Nora said, if you want. It was said with the particular casualness of someone for whom the offer was not casual at all, and Clara received it accordingly. I'd like that very much, she said. Summer was the kind that the high desert produced occasionally hot during the day and cold at night, and filled with a light that had weight to it that pressed against everything it touched. Clara taught summer sessions twice a week for the children whose families wanted them, which was most of them. She worked on the east end of the porch in the evenings when the air cooled, writing the pieces that had been accumulating in her notebook for 8 months, not journalism, not fiction exactly, something that lived between them, accounts of the valley and its people, and the particular human texture of a place that was still deciding what it was going to be. She sent 3 pieces to a newspaper in Santa Fe that fall. Editor wrote back in November saying he would take all 3 and asking if she had more. She had more. Elias read them when they were published. He didn't say much about them, which was his way. But she found, one morning in December, that he had cut the pages carefully from the newspaper and put them in the drawer of the desk in the East Room without saying anything about it. She did not mention that she had found them. She just knew they were there. The Bar C grew in the years that followed, not dramatically but steadily, in the way of things built by people who understood that endurance was a form of ambition. The water rights settlement held, and the Southern Valley recovered incrementally, not all the way, not without difficulty, but in the direction of sustainability, which was the most that could be honestly asked. Barr remained in the Upper Valley, but his influence diminished in the particular way that influence diminished when its primary instrument, control of a necessity, had been removed. School grew. By the following September, there were 23 children enrolled, and the Mercer building had been extended by a back room that Clara designed, and Elias built with Tully and Freed over 3 weeks in the summer, with a level of argument about window placement that Della said could be heard from the barn. The county increased the funding in response to the enrollment numbers, and Clara used part of it to order the books from Philadelphia that she had written for in her first weeks in Blackwater Crossing. When the books arrived, Nora helped unpack them. She was 10 years old by then, nearly 11, and she had the particular gravity of a child who had done some serious growing and was not finished. She held each book before putting it on the shelf, not reading the title, just feeling the weight of it. The way people held things they understood to be important. There are books about albatrosses, she said, finding one. I know, Clara said. I ordered it for you. Nora looked at her. Then she looked at the book. Thank you, she said. It was said simply, without performance, which was how Nora said most things, and which Clara had come to understand was the highest register of sincerity available in that household. There was an evening in the winter of 1882 years, after a woman had been thrown from a stagecoach onto a dusty road and left for the town to ignore, when Clara sat on the covered porch of the Bar C in the cold with a blanket over her legs, and her notebook open in her lap, and she looked out at the hills going dark at the edge of the valley and thought about the distance between where she was and where she had been. She did not think of it as a success story. That framing required a tidiness that the actual experience didn't have. The 2 years had been full of difficulty and miscalculation, and days that were harder than she would have chosen, and the difficulty had not disappeared. It had just changed shape, and some of it was ongoing in ways she couldn't predict. But she thought about what it meant to belong to a place, not to have conquered it, not to have been saved by it, but to belong to it, to be in genuine reciprocal relationship with the land and the people in it, contributing to them and receiving from them in the unglamorous daily way that belonging actually worked. She thought about the specific things The schoolroom smell of chalk and cold air and children who were learning to ask questions out loud. The water committee meeting she had attended as a note-taker last spring, watching Margaret Holt manage 3 opinionated ranchers with the patient expertise of a woman who had been doing it for years and had no intention of stopping. Della at the kitchen table in the early mornings, the only person in the house besides Nora who was reliably awake before the sun. Garrett Dunmore, stopping her in the street in August to tell her, some difficulty, that his youngest had read his first full sentence, and the expression on his face when he said it. Thought about the things she had written in the newspaper that fall about water rights and community and what it cost to fight for something in a place where the fighting was always longer than you expected. She had received letters about those pieces from people in other settlements, from a woman in Colorado who ran a small school, from a man she didn't know who said he had read it to his wife 3 times because she was having trouble feeling like where they were was worth staying. She thought about what her mother had written. You sound like yourself. She had not sounded like herself for a long time before she arrived here. She understood now what that had cost, the slow erosion of it over 18 months. With Victor, the particular way a person could be diminished by someone who needed them diminished in order to feel adequate. She understood it with enough distance to see it clearly, and enough honesty to know that she had participated in it, not through weakness, but through the very human tendency to make the story already in work, even when the story was wrong. She thought about all the women she knew who had stayed in the wrong story because the alternatives were invisible or seemed impossible. She thought about this not with abstraction, but with the specific faces she knew, women she had grown up with, taught alongside, passed on the street in the years when she was trying to make Victor's story work. She thought the alternative is possible. Not easy, not certain, not without cost, but possible. And the possibility is worth insisting on, even when insisting requires starting from $12 and a bent clasp in a town you never planned to stop in. Elias came out onto the porch behind her. She heard the door, and then his boots, and then he settled into the chair beside her with a cup of coffee and his own particular version of stillness. They sat in the cold for a while. "What are you writing?" he said eventually. "The beginning of something," she said. "What kind?" She looked at the hills. "About arriving," she said. "About what it actually takes, and what it's worth on the other end." He looked at the hills, too. "Is there an end?" "No," she said. "But there are places where you stop and look back and understand the distance you've covered. And that's almost the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you see?" he said. "When you look back." She thought about it. Not the quick answer, the considered one. "Someone who made a wrong choice and survived it," she said, "and then made a series of better choices. Not perfectly, but persistently." She paused and ended up somewhere she didn't expect that turned out to be the right place, which is not a plan, but it's something. He put his hand on her arm, not heavily, just present, in the way he was present, with everything fully, without reservation, without theater. "It's something," he said. The hills were dark now. Inside she could hear Nora moving around, and Della's voice from the kitchen, and the ordinary sounds of a house that was fully inhabited. Clara closed the notebook. She sat with the cold air, and the dark hills, and the sounds of the house and the weight of the hand on her arm, and she did not try to make it into something more than it was. It was already enough. It was, she thought, and she meant it plainly, without sentiment, the way you meant things when you had earned the right to mean them more than enough. The wind moved through the valley. The house held,